I learned journalism as a trade, as an apprentice, the way you would study to be a plumber, an electrician, or a carpenter, and never took a journalism class. And I think it's part of why I've stuck with it, is because my gateway to it was something that I believed in. It wasn't like a career, or I was thinking, how can I get these 3 internships to lead to this job that's going to put me on TV or make me money? It was a way of life, and it was what I believed in doing. And I sort of accidentally ended up writing this book about Blackwater because I had gone down to New Orleans in the aftermath of the flooding of the city during Hurricane Katrina, and I met these Blackwater guys who were patrolling the streets of a U.S. city with M4 assault rifles, and some of them had been in Iraq, and I asked them what they were doing, and they said, we're here to confront criminals and stop looters. And I followed these guys around for a while and ended up doing a story about them. And then I did another story about them, and I started to dig into who owns that company and what's their connection to the White House. And for me, it sort of represented so much of what was happening in the country at the time, where you had these war contractors that had profited off of the initial stages of the invasion and occupation of Iraq, coming back to the United States and disaster profiteering. They went from war profiteering to disaster profiteering and kind of had their Baghdad on the bayou in New Orleans. And Blackwater made well over $70 million on those contracts there, no-bid contracts for the Department of Homeland Security. And I became obsessed with that company and was writing article after article after article. And I had this fellowship at the Nation Institute that Naomi Klein had sort of convinced them to give me. And it was a $25,000 fellowship, which may sound great if you're an aspiring journalist, with no benefits before taxes. So it came out to, I made a few $100s a month, basically. And I loved every moment of it. And I'm writing these articles, and the Nation liked them. And Katrina Vanden Heuvel, though, the editor, finally sat me down one day and she said, Jeremy, this is great, what you're doing. It's fantastic reporting, but we are a small, poor weekly magazine. We can't publish an article on the same private company every single week in the magazine. So you either need to diversify your beat or write a book. And so I ended up writing a book, and I thought I'd be selling it out of my backpack, and then it ended up on the New York Times list, and sort of, things kind of turned upside down. But I got deep into this world of covert operations. And what was sort of amazing to me, given my orientation and where I came from, is that after the Blackwater book came out, I started to get emails and phone calls, or people would show up at my events who had been in Iraq or Afghanistan with Blackwater guys. And they were Navy SEALs or Delta Force or Army Rangers, or they were helicopter pilots, or they were colonels that were in charge of conventional operations. And they would say a similar thing, all of them. I don't really care for your politics very much, but you were 100% right about Blackwater. They didn't like them either. And I ended up getting to know a bunch of guys from this special operations community. And so the book that I wrote, Dirty Wars, it tells a couple of stories. On the one hand, it tracks the men and sometimes women, but largely it's men who are doing the killing in these operations, from the CIA and from the military's elite force called the Joint Special Operations Command. But it also tells the stories of the civilians who live in countries like Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan, who are on the other side of these operations. And woven between them are stories of warlords in Somalia who are on the CIA payroll and are being paid to hunt down and kill or capture people that have been designated as enemies of the United States, or people that are members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. And the spine of the book, the real story that runs up the center of it, is the story of a man named Anwar al-Awlaki, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. But in researching his life and ultimately his death, I was welcomed into his family's home and given access to the writings, the diaries, the home videos of his family going back many generations. And I was also allowed to interview all of the members of his family. Oftentimes, when the stories are done about Anwar al-Awlaki, only his father speaks, but I was allowed to speak to the female members of the family as well, which in that culture is rather unheard of, but I was allowed to sit down and talk with Anwar al-Awlaki's sister and with his mother, and to be around his nieces and his nephews. And I want to begin tonight discussing the story of Anwar al-Awlaki almost in reverse order, because it's important to understand that when Anwar al-Awlaki was targeted for assassination by President Obama, we crossed a line that's going to be very difficult to back up from. We have a popular Democratic president who is a constitutional lawyer by trade, who is the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, who is going to go down in history as the man who solidified assassination as a central, acceptable, in the eyes of Washington, part of U.S. national security policy, or what's called U.S. national security policy. And on the afternoon of September 30th, 2011, President Obama was briefed by Admiral William McRaven, who was the head of U.S. Special Operations Forces, and for a long time had been the commander and deputy commander of JSOC, of the Joint Special Operations Command, a man who had spent his entire military career in the shadows, conducting covert operations. He was an original member of SEAL Team 6, helped the Bush administration early on to craft their targeted killing program in the aftermath of 9/11, and then rose through the ranks and became one of the most powerful military figures in modern U.S. history. And on this day, he was briefing President Obama on this high-value target that they had been hunting for more than 2 years. And that target was unique in that he was an American citizen. And he had not been charged with a crime. He had not been indicted. There was no request for the United States to have him extradited from Yemen. And they presented the president with this briefing that they have found definitively where Anwar al-Awlaki was located. And President Obama had already served as the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury in sentencing him to death. And now he was faced with a decision on whether or not to become his executioner. Anwar al-Awlaki is probably best known by most Americans as the man who appears on YouTube clips or in photographs wearing a camouflage jacket in front of a black flag, calling on young Muslims to fight against the United States or to come and join the fronts of jihad in Afghanistan or Yemen or elsewhere. And maybe you've heard that he called Major Nidal Hassan, who conducted the massacre at Fort Hood, Texas, that after that happened, he called him a hero. And he called for other Muslims in the military to take that same action and shoot their fellow soldiers so that they couldn't deploy to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Or maybe you know about a story that has roots here locally in Seattle, when Anwar al-Awlaki named a young cartoonist named Molly Norris in an article for Inspire magazine in a list that he called the hit list, and called on people to specifically go and assassinate this young woman, Molly Norris, along with other cartoonists from around the world who had drawn what I think were very clearly derogatory images of the Prophet Muhammad that I'm sure were offensive to many Muslims, but al-Awlaki said it was worthy of death and called specifically for her to be killed. Those are the things that we hear along with the idea that he was behind the Christmas Day bomb plot when Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, this deranged young Nigerian guy, tried to bring down a U.S. airplane over the city of Detroit in Christmas Day 2009. There's a lot of smoke around Anwar al-Awlaki. Maybe Anwar al-Awlaki was everything that every leak the White House has put out or every leak that the Pentagon has put out. Maybe he was every single thing they said about him. Maybe he was plotting to poison our water supplies. Maybe he directed Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib to try to take down that aircraft. He certainly called for the assassination of a young woman in Seattle, Washington. It's quite possible that Anwar al-Awlaki did things that were absolutely, to their core, criminal in nature. This story is not about who is Anwar al-Awlaki, it's about who we are as a nation. We are defined not by how we treat the powerful or the popular or the rich. We're defined by how we treat the poorest of our people, the least of our people, and perhaps most importantly, the most reprehensible of our citizens. That's going to define our values as a society and who we are. And when we enter a world where a constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning president declares in a secret process after Terror Tuesday meetings that these Americans are not worthy of having a trial, even though they're not shooting at US soldiers on a battlefield, they're not actually firing at the US Embassy, but they're potentially engaged in plots. If we don't have a robust enough justice system to handle those people, then we should stop projecting that image to the world. We should say we're actually a different country because occasionally we allow the posse to take out their torches and round up a person and then give them just sort of citizen's justice. It's about who we are as a society, not who Anwar al-Awlaki was, but his story is revealing on that question of who we are as a society. Because he was so much more than the cartoonish image of the guy in the camouflage jacket in front of the black flag calling for armed jihad. Anwar al-Awlaki was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1971. His father's an amazing man. I've gotten to know him very well. I think he's an admirable man. I think he's a just man. And I think he did not raise his son to become the guy that we've seen in those videos, or the guy that called for Molly Norris to be killed. Molly Norris, by the way, had to go into a relocation program and move because of what happened when al-Awlaki published that. Nasser al-Awlaki, Anwar al-Awlaki's father, was a Fulbright scholar who came to the United States in 1966, and he learned English in Lawrence, Kansas. And he lived with an evangelical Christian family. And he showed me his essays from when he first came to the United States and was learning English. And he wrote this incredible essay about how he was so honored to be accepted into this program and to be a student in the United States because he viewed the US as this great bastion of progressivism. And he wanted to get an education in the United States and then return to his own country as an agricultural engineer to try to help address the very severe water crisis that to this day plagues Yemen. Yemen may be the first country in the world to entirely run out of water, and he wanted to dedicate his life to addressing that issue. And so he came here in '66 and ended up going to New Mexico State University, and he got several degrees and eventually earned his PhD. And while he was here, he was able to bring his young wife over, and they had a baby boy named Anwar. And he told me when Anwar was born in Las Cruces General Hospital that in those days you could still smoke cigars, and he handed out "It's a Boy" cigars to everyone in the hospital with him. And the family ended up moving to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota, and Anwar went to school there, and there's pictures of him pointing on a globe to where Yemen is on the map, and he couldn't pronounce his teacher's name in first grade. He just called her Mrs. M, and they went to Disneyland. And as far as the al-Awlakis were concerned, it was an American story. They were immigrants. They wanted to raise their family, if not in the United States, to grow up in the shadow of what they considered to be a society based on fundamental freedoms and of hope. Eventually, Nasser al-Awlaki was called back to Yemen to serve as a government minister, and he moved his young family back with him, and he ended up starting a Department of Agricultural Engineering at the University of Sana'a, and it was largely built up with money from the United States, from the U.S. Agency for International Development. And Anwar went to a school that his father and some others had set up, and it was a school that was in both English and Arabic. His first language was English, and he went to school with the children of the most powerful people in Yemen, the family of the US-backed dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. And he ended up going to school with the children and nephews of the president, who would go on to run Yemen's intelligence agencies and then collude with the United States government in hunting down and attempting to kill Anwar al-Awlaki. He graduates from high school and comes to the United States to go to university in Colorado, and when he arrives in the United States, it was right on the eve of the 1991 Gulf War, where of course anyone who was around at the time or remembers what happened, the US destroyed the civilian infrastructure of one of the more modern societies in the Middle East and systematically targeted and took out the civilian infrastructure and rolled the clock back on Baghdad hundreds of years. And Anwar al-Awlaki was not a particularly religious guy at the time, but he was politicized, as many young people were at the time, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, by that war. And he started going to organizing meetings. And eventually he was invited by the imam at a local mosque near his university to come and give a speech. And when Anwar came to give this speech, the imam said, you are such a gifted orator, will you come back again? And he started speaking at that mosque, and he started to attend services, and he became more and more religious, and eventually he decided he didn't want to study engineering anymore, he wanted to study to be an imam. And so he changed course in his life and did become an imam. And he lived in San Diego for a while and eventually got a job as the imam at a very large religious center in Falls Church, Virginia, the Dar al-Hijra Mosque. And I remember, the first time that I remember seeing Anwar al-Awlaki was shortly after 9/11. He was profiled by the Washington Post. He was interviewed by NPR, by Ray Suarez on Talk of the Nation. He was on the NewsHour on PBS. And he was on these shows because Anwar al-Awlaki was considered a moderate imam who was making sense of the experience of so many American Muslims in the aftermath of the attack and being caught between wanting justice for what happened on 9/11 and wanting to see those who had done it brought to justice, but also fearful of the bigotry that was being unleashed and the targeting of Muslims and the rounding up of people and the vandalism and attacks on taxi drivers and businesses. And the day after September 11th, a woman had stumbled into al-Awlaki's mosque after being beaten with a baseball bat because she was a Muslim. And he was a man who was helping big media outlets make sense of what was happening in Muslim communities across the country. And he was a man who was essentially a media star, but he also was being harassed by the FBI, interrogated because some of the 9/11 hijackers had, on some occasions, attended one of his mosques in San Diego and another one in Virginia, and they were putting pressure on him to flip and become an FBI informant. And he's feeling all of the pressure that so many Muslims were feeling, but he also had this secret life where he was being pressured by the FBI, and eventually he decides to leave the United States. And he leaves the United States as the invasion of Iraq is mounting, and it's becoming an inevitability. And then you see a shift in Anwar al-Awlaki's politics. He became more radical as the US wars became more entrenched. As we saw the images coming out of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and the Iraq invasion turned from being this myth that Paul Wolfowitz put forward, that they'll welcome us with flowers and it'll pay for itself, and the fabricated pulling down of Saddam's statue and the false flag of victory being planted in the corpse of Iraq, and then the civil war breaking out. And al-Awlaki, as the US wars expanded, al-Awlaki's radicalism deepened. And he started to gain a huge following among English-speaking Muslims around the world. And he was speaking out about US support for the Israeli incursions into Palestine. And he was speaking out against the threats that the US was making about going into Iran or going into Syria. And he was fond of quoting George Bush, calling it a crusade. And he was starting to have great influence, and in 2006, he was living with his family in Sana'a, trying to figure out what to do next, just recording sermons, when he was arrested on trumped-up charges that he had intervened in a tribal dispute in Yemen. And he gets put in prison for 18 months, 17 of them in solitary confinement. I was told by former senior Yemeni officials that when Anwar al-Awlaki was in prison, there was so much pressure for him to be released that the Yemeni government asked the people who had put him there in the first place if they could let him go, and those people were senior officials from the Bush administration. And there was a meeting in Washington between the Yemeni ambassador to the US, one of the most powerful Saudis in the world, Bandar Bush, who's called Bandar Bush because he's so close to the Bush family, and John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence. And Negroponte told the Yemeni official at the meeting that it was the position of the US that they wanted Anwar al-Awlaki to be kept in prison for 4 or 5 years, even without charge, so that young Muslims would forget about him. But eventually the pressure was too strong on the Yemeni government, and they had to release al-Awlaki. And when he came out, he published his prison writings, and they're fascinating. They wouldn't allow him to have many books. They gave him Shakespeare, and he hated Shakespeare. They gave him Dickens, and he loved Dickens. He compared figures in the US government and the Yemeni government to characters like Uriah Heep, and talked about the experience of Muslims as represented by some of the characters in Dickens. But he also clearly was a changed man. He was radicalized even further by that experience, and when he came out, his message was sharper than ever. And he started a blog called Imam Anwar's Blog, and the internet became his mosque. And he began to celebrate the victories of Islamist movements around the world. When the Islamic Courts Union overthrew the US-backed warlords in Somalia, he sent salutations not only to the Islamic Courts Union, which was a Taliban-like coalition in Somalia, but also to a group called Al-Shabaab, which eventually would go on to pledge its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. He was answering questions about whether or not suicide bombing was acceptable under the teachings of the Quran, and ultimately, in an essay entitled Suicide or Martyrdom, took the side that suicide bombing was acceptable. And the US is putting this pressure on the Yemeni government to have him arrested, and eventually Anwar decides, because he's being monitored by the Yemeni, US-backed Yemeni counterterrorism units, to go underground. And he leaves the capital of Sana'a, and he goes to his family's tribal land, where it was very difficult for the Americans or the Yemeni forces to monitor him. And in the middle of 2009, his father was approached by the head of Yemen's intelligence service and told, if you don't put Anwar back in our prison or put him under some kind of house arrest, the Americans have told us they're going to kill him with a drone. Now, this is before anyone has alleged that al-Awlaki was involved with any active terror plots, that this family was told that because of your son's sermons and his words, however offensive many of us may find them, he had already had a bullseye placed on his head and a potential assassination order against him given. And so his own father, this professor, a former government minister, travels to their province and says to his son, you have to come back to Sana'a or the Americans are going to kill you with a drone. And at the time, remember, this is mid-2009, President Obama had already started to intensify the drone attacks on Pakistan. There had not yet been a drone bombing in Yemen, but it was a very real situation, and Anwar had talked about it on his blog. And Anwar al-Awlaki was so offended that his father would say this to him. He basically said, are you an agent for the Americans now? I'm not going to allow them to tell me which way to position my bed. And he said, I was born free and I'll die free, and I don't want you to ever speak to me about this again. And that was the last time that his father spoke to him. After that, Anwar left his wife and his 3 children with his family in Sana'a, and he went underground. And the hunt for Anwar al-Awlaki began. And his children in Sana'a, there are 3 of them. The eldest was a boy named Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was born in Denver, Colorado in 1995. And he was the sort of prized jewel of his grandparents, and they adore him and they want him to go to the United States to get a college education. And he's a normal, goofy, lanky teenager with this enormous afro that they're constantly telling him to cut, and he has pictures on his Facebook page posing as a rapper, and he's into comic books, and he's sort of the furthest thing from who his father was. And so these kids are being raised by their grandparents. Their father is on the run. They know that the US government has told the Yemeni government, we're going to kill him if you don't put him back in prison. And while Anwar is making these audio tapes and videotapes and moving around the hinterlands of Yemen, Nidal Hasan commits his massacre at Fort Hood. And it emerges that Anwar al-Awlaki had been in touch with him. And the story became that Anwar al-Awlaki orchestrated the Fort Hood massacre. But when US officials, intelligence officials, intercepted those emails and reviewed them, they determined that al-Awlaki had nothing to do with it. I now have the emails and I write about them in the book. Nidal Hasan was basically kind of a creepy stalker. He's like that guy you don't want to see on your OkCupid or something, and he's asking al-Awlaki to help him find a wife at one point. Can you hook a brother up? And asking him to find a wife. And then he says, I want to give you a prize for $5,000 for being Anwar al-Awlaki, and I want to have an essay contest in your name. And al-Awlaki's saying things like, give the money to the orphans, no, I don't want the award, you're embarrassing me. In any case, the massacre happens, then the story comes out that al-Awlaki's been in email touch with Hasan, and al-Awlaki was getting emails from people all over the world, so he gets sort of painted with this brush. And that could have been addressed, except what al-Awlaki did the day after that sealed his fate. He wrote a blog post that said Nidal Hasan was a hero, and he called on other US soldiers to commit similar acts. And then a month later, the Christmas Day bomb plot happens with Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, and al-Awlaki gives an interview in which he says that he was one of his students. Now, the US claims that al-Awlaki directed that attack and actually authorized, religiously authorized Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib to blow up that airplane. I don't know what the facts are. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. No evidence has been presented that suggests that he did. We don't know. The US then, for the first time, tries to kill Anwar al-Awlaki in December of 2009. And by my count, they tried over a dozen times to kill him. In one case, which was extraordinary, it was almost out of a Hollywood movie, al-Awlaki was in Shabwa province driving in a truck with another one of his colleagues, and the US sent in a couple of drones and other aircraft, and they were tracking him, and they launch a missile at his car, and they miss it, and it causes the vehicle to sort of blow forward, and it blew out part of the back window, and al-Awlaki and his cohorts think that they're being ambushed. They don't think it's a drone, they think it's an RPG, and then another missile hits, and it misses the car, but it hits nearby, and it causes this huge dust-up to happen, and al-Awlaki calls for backup, and these two brothers, the Harad brothers, come from a nearby village, and they race to the rescue, and in the smoke, the U.S. satellites could not make out what was happening below, and they switch vehicles, and al-Awlaki gets into their Suzuki Jeep, and they get into his truck, and they exit in opposite ways of the smoke, and the U.S. war planners had only one missile left, so they had to choose which vehicle to target, and they go for the original one. So al-Awlaki watched as they blew up his vehicle with these two guys in it, and he survived that strike that night. And he said later in an essay, 11 missiles missed their target tonight, but maybe the next one will hit its mark. And while this manhunt is going on, they're trying on all fronts to track him as they find him, lose him, miss him, find him, lose him, miss him. At one point, they approach Anwar al-Awlaki's, the CIA approaches Anwar al-Awlaki's youngest brother, Ammar, who works for an oil company and is like a hipster, basically. He's got a goatee, and he wears some cool glasses, and he wears jeans, and he's not like his brother and barely knows his brother. He's working for an oil company. He's in Austria on business. He gets a call in his hotel room one night from a guy who says, "Oh, my wife and your wife are friends. They used to work together. I have a gift for her. Come down and meet me in the lobby." He comes down the lobby. It's a guy named Chris, quote unquote, who basically says, "I don't know your wife and I don't have a gift for her, but there's a $5 million bounty on your brother's head, and we want you to give up his location." So they're trying that. Then, and this is one of my favorite stories, this Danish guy named Morten Storm, who also goes by Murad Storm, he was a student with al-Awlaki in Yemen when al-Awlaki was sort of first becoming radicalized. And this guy's a sort of rank opportunist. He had maintained this contact with al-Awlaki. He realizes that the CIA is going after al-Awlaki and goes to the Danish intelligence service and says, "I'm still in touch with Anwar al-Awlaki, and I can get messages, maybe I can help you track him." And they end up paying this guy $250,000 to work with him. And what Morten Storm does is says to al-Awlaki, "I can find you a wife to live with you underground." And so he's communicating in encrypted emails with al-Awlaki, and he posts basically like a wife wanted ad on Facebook. And sort of women from around the world are replying to these messages about wanting to go live with Anwar al-Awlaki underground. And eventually this woman named Amina, who was from Croatia and was a convert to Islam, starts communicating with al-Awlaki, and they're sending videos back and forth, and al-Awlaki determines that he wants to marry her and that she should come to Yemen. So unbeknownst to both Amina and Anwar al-Awlaki, Morten Storm is working with his own intelligence service from the Danish intelligence service, the PET, and with the CIA. And so the CIA handlers come and meet with this guy before Amina is going to travel to Yemen to join Anwar al-Awlaki underground, and they give Amina luggage, she doesn't know she's working for the CIA, that has these tracking devices in it. And they're thinking, okay, this is good. This woman's going to go with her toiletry bags and all of this stuff that we've given her as a gift, Gucci, and she's going to arrive there and it's going to lead us to Anwar al-Awlaki. So she arrives in Yemen with the CIA's luggage, and Anwar al-Awlaki's colleagues pick her up at the airport, and they force her to ditch everything, all of her clothes, all of the bags. And so the CIA's tracking devices are left in the airport, and she goes on to marry Anwar al-Awlaki, live with him underground, and they have a child together. So it's the CIA's dating service for Anwar al-Awlaki, and they help find him a wife. So he's living happily with his CIA-facilitated wife. I'm sure he wasn't happy, but he's underground and he's on the run. A number of times they almost kill him. While he's underground, his son, Abdul Rahman, is coming of age and is reading about his father and is seeing the news reports that the most powerful nation in the world is hunting his father, and he sees him being compared to Osama bin Laden, and bin Laden has just been killed. Al-Awlaki has just narrowly escaped the 11th or 12th drone strike attempt on him. And the kid, this 16-year-old Abdul Rahman, decides he wants to find his father. So he, very early one morning, before morning prayers, gets up and he sneaks into his mom's bedroom, and he takes the equivalent of $40 in Yemeni riyals from her purse, and he leaves her a small note that basically says, "I'm sorry that I stole this money, I'll pay you back. I miss my father and I want to go and find him." And he packs a small bag and he leaves out the family's kitchen window, and he goes to the bus station in Bab el Yemen, in the old city in Sana'a, and he gets on a bus to go to where he thinks his father is, Shebwa, where the scene of repeated drone strikes against his dad. And he runs away from home, and he goes there, and his plan, I think, was to try to figure out if somebody somewhere knows where his dad is. So he goes to the place where he knows that they're trying to kill him. Well, the family, the grandparents are beside themselves. They can't believe it. They're trying to reach him. He won't answer. He won't come to the phone when they call the relatives there. The relatives say he's okay. And while he's there, his father gets killed in this drone strike on September 30th, 2011, nowhere near where the kid is, nowhere near Shebwa. He's killed in the north of Yemen. And he was killed with another American named Samir Khan, who's a Pakistani-American widely believed to have been the editor-in-chief of Inspire magazine, the magazine of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so these two are killed, and in Washington, these two Americans get killed, and in Washington, the reaction sort of fell into one of two camps, either silence or enthusiastic support. Hillary Clinton praised it, John McCain praised it, Dianne Feinstein praised it, Lindsey Graham praised it. One congressman said, well, if Samir Khan wasn't on the target list, it was a bonus, it was a twofer. You know, we killed these two American citizens, neither of whom had been charged with a crime. And so these guys are killed. The son has run away from home and is in Shebwa province, and his grandmother calls him and says, Abdulrahman, it's finished, your father is dead, you have to come home. And he said, yeah, I'll come home as soon as I can, but the roads are blocked. At the time, it was what's called the Arab Spring. These uprisings against these US-backed dictatorships were happening, and in Yemen there was a rebellion against the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh, and he was in a part of the country where there was a tremendous amount of fighting, and the roads were blockaded, so he had to wait until it calmed down so that he could get back safely. And so he was staying with his relatives, and his father had just been killed, and he was despondent, and his relatives were encouraging him to go out. And so one night he goes out with his 17-year-old cousin Ahmed and some other young people from their tribe, and they're sitting having dinner in a makeshift sort of outdoor restaurant when a drone appears above them and launches a missile and blows these kids to pieces. And on October 15th, the day after, Nasser al-Awlaki, his grandfather, receives this call, finding out that just 2 weeks after his son was killed, that his eldest grandson had been killed in a drone strike, and they said that they couldn't identify all of the bodies of the young people because the drone blew them to pieces, but they found a part of Abdulrahman's head, and they knew it was him because of his huge head of hair, because it was very unusual in that culture to have that kind of hairstyle, and they buried them all in one grave. And after Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, 16-year-old US citizen, born in Denver, Colorado, was killed, there was no explanation as to why. It seemed to me, and I'm sure it seems to plenty of you, an almost impossible coincidence. You know, you can understand, and the al-Awlaki family understands why the United States wanted to kill Anwar. They didn't support it. They think that the US exaggerated his role within al-Qaeda, but they understood why the US wanted him dead. But to them, the killing of their 16-year-old grandson, who hadn't seen his father in years, who was into hip-hop music and comic books and was a quiet, lanky, goofy, wonderful older brother to his younger siblings, and I saw endless home videos of this kid. No way on earth that that kid was involved with anything vaguely resembling al-Qaeda or terrorism or anything of the sort. And to them, it just seems so cold-blooded, and certainly the US is going to say how this happened, why it happened. Please tell us it's just some mistake of history. Or tell us that you killed our grandson because you were fed bad information, but don't say nothing. And what was said, and they watched in awe, was that US military officials leaked stories to journalists that the al-Awlaki kid was 21, and that he was at an al-Qaeda meeting when he was killed. And then they said, well, he was meeting with Ibrahim al-Bana, one of the propagandists for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But then it turns out that Ibrahim al-Bana is alive. You know, we've killed the number 2 man in AQAP, Saeed al-Shiri. We've killed him 12 times this year. He was killed 2 weeks ago, and then a week ago he released an audio statement referencing current events. I mean, AQAP is more reliable, unfortunately, in who's dead and who's alive in al-Qaeda than the Washington Post or the New York Times. So we know that the guy they said they were trying to kill there is alive. So why was Abdulrahman al-Awlaki killed? When Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, was asked about the killings of Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan and Abdulrahman al-Awlaki by Candy Crowley on CNN, the response of Harry Reid was, if there were 3 Americans that deserved to die, those 3 did. And I went after Harry Reid and I was asking him, what crime did Abdulrahman al-Awlaki commit? Because you said those 3. What did that 16-year-old do? What evidence do you have? No response. I went after him then on Twitter, trying to shame his office into providing some response, and then they blocked my Twitter account. So we've never gotten an explanation from him. Robert Gibbs, who was the former White House press secretary, when he was asked by a young reporter named Sierra Adamson about, and you can see this on YouTube, about the killing of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, his response was he should have had a more responsible father. There are few things more shameful in world history than blaming the killing of children on who their parents were, or something that their parents did, or the last name of your family. And that was the statement by a man, not who was just some pundit on MSNBC. At the time, he was the surrogate for the Obama 2012 re-election campaign. He was the senior spokesperson for the president's re-election campaign. And so I have pressed on this with a handful of other journalists, and no one has ever presented a public shred of evidence or explanation as to why that kid was killed. After I was finished with my book, I met a former senior official in the Obama administration who directly worked on the kill program. And he only spoke to me on the agreement that I wouldn't publish his name, and it was not a friendly interaction, but I was sort of chasing him around a parking lot, and eventually he turned around and said, fine, I'll talk to you. And I asked him about Abdul Rahman, and he said, did the ACLU put you up to this? And then he asked the ACLU later, did you put Scahill up to this? And they said, no, I think he does okay, you don't need to put him up to it. So I asked him about the killing of Abdul Rahman, and he said to me, look, I think it was a mistake. And I said, what do you mean you think it was a mistake? You were there at the time signing off on the strikes. And he said, well, look, when the president heard that the kid had been killed, he was very upset. We had been told that this terrorist that we were targeting was alone, and they didn't tell us that these young people were there. And he said that John Brennan, who at the time, and this to me is significant, John Brennan at the time was the senior counterterrorism advisor, now of course the director of the CIA, that Brennan thought that either the CIA or JSOC had intentionally targeted the kid and did not believe that it could be a coincidence, which is what I don't believe it could be a coincidence. Some piece is missing there. So Brennan then orders a review. That review hasn't been published, if it happened. This official said he didn't know the result of that review. When I tried to ask the White House and the National Security Council about it, they said they wouldn't comment on whether a review was or was not done, and that they won't discuss the specifics of operations. But then this official assured me that all is actually well. It was just a mistake. He was collateral damage. We were trying to get a guy nearby, and it's just a mistake. Though he's just asking me to accept that on faith, and that's not how journalism works. And I said, well, if it's a mistake, why don't you publicly come out and say, we tried to kill this specific individual, that kid was there, we are deeply sorry for the killing of this innocent kid, but X, Y, and Z were happening at the time. We might not like it, but at least they give some explanation or offer some compensation. And he said, look, we had just killed 3 US citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets, Samir Khan and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. It doesn't look good. It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. So the reason why there's never been a public explanation for why this 16-year-old kid was killed in a drone strike by the commander-in-chief of his own government is because it would have been too embarrassing to offer up an explanation. Now, I firmly believe that whether you're an American or a non-American bears no relevance at all to our discussions on a moral level. The death of a Pakistani 16-year-old who doesn't even know the United States exists, his life is worth just as much as the life of a 16-year-old who goes to a nice high school here in Seattle. No difference between the two of them. But there are issues about the targeting of American citizens that cut to the core of who we are as a society. Because if we don't even afford our own citizens due process or explain why someone is executed before they've even been charged with a crime, that cuts to the heart of who we are as a society. In the book, I talk about another bombing in Yemen that happened in December of 2009. It was the first time President Obama authorized the bombing of Yemen. And again, they say they were hunting down this nefarious al-Qaeda guy, and they bombed what they claimed was a al-Qaeda training camp in the village of al-Majla. Well, it turns out that it was a Bedouin village, and that among the 46 dead were 14 women and 21 children. And I went to Abyan province and interviewed the survivors of it. And we videotaped the missile parts. And it showed clearly that it's a cruise missile. Yemen doesn't have them. and that the US had used cluster bombs, which are like flying landmines and are banned under international conventions. And after this bombing happened, the Yemeni government issued a press release saying that it had conducted air raids and blew up this al-Qaeda training camp. And President Obama sent his congratulations to the Yemeni government. And David Petraeus, at the time the CENTCOM commander, had gone to Yemen and conspired with the Yemeni regime to have the US bomb Yemen and then Yemen take credit for it, and then everyone will never know for the better. But because of brave young journalists from Yemen going there initially and doing what we did also later, which to go and film the missile parts, the world knew that it was a US bombing. And when this first journalist arrived there, named Abdullah Haider Shaya, when he filmed those missile parts and sent them to Amnesty International, and the world knew that President Obama had initiated the bombing of yet another country, of Yemen, that journalist was abducted by Yemen's intelligence services, beaten and threatened. He was told, "You need to stop talking about this story on Al Jazeera and elsewhere, or we'll put you back in prison." And he kept on talking about it. And then eventually, he was arrested and disappeared for 30 days into the basement of the Political Security Organization in Yemen, which is a US-funded entity. And then he was hauled into court, and he was charged with being an al-Qaeda facilitator in a court that was set up to prosecute journalists who committed crimes against the state in Yemen, against the dictatorship in Yemen. A court that was condemned by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists and every human and civil rights organization and media freedom organization in the world. And his trial was a sham. They put him in a cage in the courtroom. And when he was brought out into this cage in the courtroom, he said that, "I am being prosecuted because the Americans didn't want me to expose their cruise missile attack on this Bedouin village and show the world what they had done." And he was then yanked away from the court and taken back into the prison. And he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And there was so much outrage and outcry in Yemen, where the tribal system is far more powerful than the government, that the dictator of Yemen was forced to release him. And he was getting ready to issue a pardon. And it leaked in Yemen's official news service that Ali Abdullah Saleh was going to pardon the journalist Abdullah Haider Shaya. And that day, he was going to sign the pardon, he received a phone call from the White House, not from one of President Obama's aides, not from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but from President Obama himself. And President Obama told him that he was deeply concerned about the reports that they were going to pardon Abdullah Haider Shaya. And the dictator of Yemen ripped up the pardon and kept that journalist in prison. He remains in that prison to this day on orders from President Obama. And his crime was exposing a US cruise missile attack on Yemen that the US government tried to cover up and blame on the Yemeni government. And lest you think I'm engaged in a conspiracy theory about this, go and visit whitehouse.gov tonight and look for the press release from February of 2011 that is a readout of a phone call between Obama and Ali Abdullah Saleh, and they put it right there. When I called the State Department and asked them, after he had been in prison for almost 2 years, if it was still the US government position that he remains in prison, they told me he remains a dangerous terrorist and he should be kept in prison. The stakes are very high around the world for people who dare to expose a missile attack that was not supposed to have taken place or was supposed to be the action of a dictatorship. The stakes are very high for people that worked at the National Security Agency in the US and blow the whistle on warrantless wiretapping. This administration has cracked down on whistleblowers in a more aggressive way than all presidents combined in modern times. There's a CIA officer named John Kiriakou who's doing a prison term right now, in part for revealing classified information to journalists about the US torture program. But Jose Rodriguez, who was one of the creators of the black site system and an enthusiastic promoter of torture, who said that we had to put on our big boy pants after 9/11, he is lionized in documentaries and films and permitted to walk around this society as a free man making money off of writing books about how great torture is. It says a lot about what's happening in our society. I also traveled to Somalia, where I walked around with CIA warlords and talked to people who had been put in a prison in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service. Obama ended black sites. He supposedly ended torture. But what we're doing now is we're letting Somali thugs torture prisoners that are in a prison on orders from the United States, who have been rendered from other countries, brought to this gulag, put in that prison, but it's all the Somalis doing it. Our guys are just standing in the room. What's the difference between operating a black site in Poland and having the CIA doing the torture and operating a proxy detention center in Somalia that's technically run by Somalis, but you're there directing their every move? It's just torture by puppet. You're not actually doing it yourself. It's like torture ventriloquism or something. Around the world, we are making more enemies than we are killing terrorists. When you engage in a policy, as we do, called signature strikes, which is a grotesque form of pre-crime, when you categorize people in Yemen or Pakistan as terrorists, but you don't know their identities, you categorize them as terrorists because they're military-age males, and they're in a certain region, and someone in their group has been on the phone with someone else who we believe to be a terrorist, and you preemptively say, well, those guys must be up to no good, or they will be someday, and so they're legitimate targets. That's what the policy is right now in certain areas of Pakistan and certain areas of Yemen. My friend Fareeha al-Muslimi, who was a young Yemeni guy who testified in front of the US Senate, said that the United States achieved in one drone strike what al-Qaeda has been trying to do for a decade. They turned his village against America and put them on the side of al-Qaeda. I can't tell you how many times I heard people whose communities had been targeted in raids or strikes say, when that happened, I want to put on a suicide vest and blow myself up among the Americans. Or I've hated al-Qaeda my whole life, but the enemy of my enemy has become my friend because of what you did to my family. We are going to pay a price for this down the line. It may come in the form of a bombing of a subway, or the downing of an airliner, or the kidnapping of American tourists abroad, but we will pay for it in some form or another if we don't wake up and understand the impact of our actions. I want to wrap up, but I want to say one final thing on this subject. If you remember when Governor George Ryan, who was the governor of the state of Illinois, he was a Republican and was a co-chair of Bush's 2000 campaign. He has a complicated story and he ended up in prison, and that's for a different discussion. But George Ryan called for a moratorium on the death penalty in the state of Illinois. Why did he do it? Is it because he's a card-carrying member of Amnesty International? Because he has a moral opposition to the death penalty? No. He did it because great young students from the Innocence Project and tireless advocates for the rights of prisoners and those on death row started investigating cases. Through DNA evidence, exonerated a number of prisoners. It became clear that innocent people were being put to death on death row. In the pursuit of the guilty, they were also killing the innocent. And it was happening in such large numbers, and so many cases of people that had already been killed or were about to be killed came to light that George Ryan did the responsible thing. He said, we have to put a moratorium on the death penalty until we can examine how all of this happened. I'm against drone strikes, period. I don't think they're effective on a tactical level, and I don't think that they're worth it on a moral level at all. But I also think that there is a reason for people, even if you think this is a smarter, cleaner way of waging war, which I assure you it's not, but even if you believe that, it's gotten so out of control at this point with the number of innocent people that have been killed that there should be a moratorium on drone strikes so that we know who has been killed. Let's bring it to the front. Let's know the names of the people in Pakistan that we've killed, the names of the people in Yemen that we've killed, and even though they're dead now, let's go back and see what evidence was there to suggest that those 14 women and 21 children who were killed, shredded into meat in Al-Majla, Yemen, on December 17, 2009, what crime did the 6-year-old girl commit against the United States so that her arm was a half a mile away from her head when they found her body? What crime did she commit? Because this cuts to the heart of who we are as a society. It's being done in all of our names. And whether you support the drone strikes as a smarter way of war or you're against them because you think they're immoral, you have to be against the targeting of people whose identity we don't know, evidence against whom we don't possess, the names of which we don't know. You have to say that is not right on a moral level, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would venture to guess that it's probably illegal too. It's long past due that we had that discussion in this country. Look at how we were gripped by fear when the Boston bombing happened, they shut the whole city down in a curfew, paralyzed nation in many ways. Frightened, we respond to fear. The calls for the Tsarnaev kid to be treated as an enemy combatant. And now they've rounded up these other kids, and I don't know who was involved with what, and I want people brought to justice who do those things, but there should be a trial, and we shouldn't have the posse or the lynch mob going to round people up. And the media circus was despicable, disgraceful, and full of bigotry when you stick the picture of a track star who happens to be a person of color on the front page of the New York Post and imply that the FBI is looking for him. You are tarring that kid's reputation and attempting to ruin his life, and it was racist to the core what the New York Post did. And the media coverage has been atrocious, but there's one part of it that was and remains outstanding. And that's the coverage of who died in that bombing and who was injured, and the stories of heroes like Carlos Arredondo, who rescued the man who is now a double amputee, and that iconic picture of Carlos Arredondo, who is a famed activist who is standing up for veterans and is also an anti-war activist and has suffered tremendously in his personal life. But he was there that day as part of a coalition of people that were raising money for wounded veterans, and he ran toward the site of the explosion, and he helped to rescue this guy, and we know his story, and we know the story of that adorable 8-year-old kid. And I think a lot of you have probably seen that picture of him holding up the peace sign that he had painted a short time before. He was so viciously blown up that day in Boston. And we know about the graduate student from China. President Obama said her name. I was with a Chinese friend recently, and she told me that after that happened and President Obama said the name of that Chinese woman who was killed that day, who was a graduate student here, that someone wrote a blog post in China that said, "Where you die matters." And the point of it was that if she had died in a factory explosion in China making a product for the United States, her name would have never, ever been mentioned by the most powerful man in the world. But where you die matters. And we know the stories of all of those people because journalists did their job and humanized the victims of a terrible, terrible crime. And because we know the stories of those people, we have a human connection to it even if we didn't meet them. And the same was true of Newtown and Sandy Hook and the Virginia Tech shooting and the stories of the heroes and the victims and the innocents taken away. Can you imagine if that is how reporters covered the victims of drone strikes or of night raids, where instead of focusing on the real housewives of New York and their Pinot Grigio, we focused on the real widows of Baghdad and what they've lost from a war that never should have been started in the first place, or the real widowers of Mogadishu. So in closing, I want to say that I think one of the most simple truths in the world is that it's very difficult to empathize with the fate of others unless you are able to see their humanity. And one of the core responsibilities of journalists is to see the humanity in people irrespective of their nationality or what they're accused of or who they may or may not become one day. Because only when we empathize with the other, only when we try to put ourselves in their shoe, do we learn real lessons about ourselves as a society and what we actually believe. Our instinct is for our hearts to bleed for the victims of incidents like the Boston bombing or Sandy Hook or Newtown. Why shouldn't it be true that our instinct is also to have our hearts bleed for the victims of these bombings around the world? Because I guarantee you, if that's how their stories were told, we'd have a very, very different discussion in this country. And it's long past time that that discussion begin. Thank you very much.
My name's Gordon. I was in Afghanistan from 2007 and 2008, and it's work that you, Amy, Chris, Noam did that kept me from re-enlisting, so thanks for that. But also I wanted to have you elaborate a little on like the cavalier and narcissistic attitude that guys like Blackwater, guys in special ops, you know, these guys that are supposed to be the best of the best, but a lot of times the way that they operate, it looks like they're inspired by Steven Seagal or Jean-Claude Van Damme or something.
You know, I think what's interesting is the guys I know who are in the SEALs or in the actual military in Iraq. I mean, most of the Blackwater guys served at one point or another in the military, and many of them served for a good long stint. You know, there's a lot of 30-somethings that were working in those jobs, and I think that, you know, you get this sense that you are a rock star of the war zone and that you're going to tell the colonel what's what because you're the big bad Blackwater guy. And a lot of times what happened with them is that they would, you know, do something stupid and they would, you know, or criminal. They'd shoot at people, they'd go night hunting in their helicopters, or they'd throw these booze and steroid parties, and then they'd end up going out on a roid rage and killing people. And who pays the price for that besides the Iraqis or Afghans that are being killed? Oftentimes it's the kid in the Pennsylvania National Guard who's then patrolling, you know, some awful fob somewhere, or is, you know, happens to be on a routine patrol. And, you know, the guy whose family got killed by the Blackwater guys, he's not going to go and say, well, does anyone know the address of the Blackwater compound in Iraq? He's going to kill the first American or go after the first American that he sees. And, you know, the U.S. military is full of people that have those stories about that. And it's not just Blackwater. That happens in the military, too. There's a difference between, you know, murder and killing. And people sometimes forget that there's a heck of a lot of murder that has taken place in these war zones. And, you know, there's a great film. By the way, our film is coming out this summer. It'll be out June 7th around the country. But there's a film called The Kill Team that I think is going to be on PBS. And this filmmaker, Dan Kraus, made it. And he's looking at the Stryker Brigade and these guys who were, in a very sick, sadistic way, going out and murdering Afghans, these U.S. military guys, murdering Afghans and cutting fingers off and keeping them as trophies and making necklaces out of them. And they were doing it as sort of a hazing ritual that this one captain is having his men sort of be initiated into the club by doing it. So, I mean, the scale of murder that took place in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't know that we'll ever fully come to terms with it. And Blackwater certainly was an all-star team of people engaged in just wanton killing of people. I mean, it was awful.